As always, feel free to let us know where you are tuning in from. And we have a chat module. Oops, let's see. Closed captioning. Yes, you can close caption. All right, let's just give it a few more minutes. Nicole from San Diego, sunny San Diego. I am here in Providence, Rhode Island, where it is unseasonably warm. And I'd like to say hello to folks tuning into the live stream, as well as the folks here in the Zoom room. We're going to give it a couple more minutes. We are waiting for one more panelist. We're dealing with some technical difficulties right now, but it's great to see. We've got NYC, some more California folks, Milan, Italy. Well, thank you for staying up for this and tuning into this. All right. BC, South Carolina, Portland. Awesome. All right. All right. Give us a bit. We are waiting for our Yale representative. Just stay tuned. And if you're watching the recording later on, we will just edit this part out. All right, we got confirmation he'll be joining us soon. We had some things lost in the internets. Sorry about that. Janet, thank you. Great to hear from you as well. I'll just brief. Ooh, we've got two Minneapolises in a row. Doug is from Minneapolis originally, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm in Austin, Texas now, and but Minneapolis native.
Awesome. Oh, we've got Canada in the house as well.
I have a feeling it's chilly up there.
Everything's topsy-turvy though, right? It's like colder in Austin than it is in Providence right now.
That's right.
Ice and snow, says Jenna. All right. All right, Rodrigo is in transit, but he is joining us now. Awesome. All right. Thank you for bearing with us. We can go a little bit later for the stream, and we'll record this and post this online. We'll give Rodrigo a chance to get set up, but in the meantime, I'll just kick things off. Thank you for tuning in, everybody, or hello to the folks watching this recording in the future, and apologies again for our technical difficulties. It's good to see everyone and some familiar names here in the chat as well. My name is Lishan Huang. For folks who don't know me, I am the Director of Design Content and Learning here at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. And you are in the right place if you're here for the online open house for the 2023 Business Perspectives for Creative Leaders program. This is an executive education program, a partnership between AIG and Yale that's been going on for at least almost 2 decades now. The current incarnation of the program dates back to 2008, and it's shifted a little bit since the pandemic to an online format, and we'll talk about that as part of this open house as well. I'll introduce our 2 panelists for today in addition to myself, and I'll have a few questions to kind of kick us off the conversation. And for folks in the audience, feel free to type in the chat or use the Q&A pod, and let me rename Rodrigo so he's not the guest speaker. So you can see where he is. There we go. All right. So our first guest and panelist is Rodrigo Canales. He is the faculty director of the Business Perspectives for Creative Leaders program at the Yale School of Management. and he studies organizational behavior. We'll hear more about his research and teaching a little bit later on as well. And so he's here to talk to us about the program. And then we also have Douglas Powell, who is a longtime member and leader, design leader in the AIGA community as well, who is an alum of the program from back in the day. So we have an alumni perspective as well to answer some of your questions. And we'll hear from him about his experiences in the program as well. And he was just telling me before we went live, he's still in contact with the folks that he was in the program with. So it really is about learning as well as community, which is something we love to do here at AIGA. So just to tee things off, as I mentioned, this executive education program is a partnership between AIGA and Yale. It's designed to equip creative leaders like yourselves here on the live stream to meet the challenges of management and to give you the skills and perspectives you need to reach the next level in your careers. So with that, maybe I'll tee up the first question for Rodrigo. We've talked about this in the past, but to kind of build on this about getting to the next level for creative leaders and designers, you've identified before this gap between like the skills that get you to where you are maybe currently as a designer. These aren't necessarily the skills that will get you to the next level as a leader. And so can you tell us a little bit about the gap and how this program helps address that?
Yes, of course, Lishang. Thank you for the invitation. Doug, it's wonderful to see you. Lishang, it's wonderful to see you as well. And I'm sorry that I was a little bit delayed. I was having trouble, embarrassingly, finding the link to connect today, as these things happen. And I think you're absolutely right that my experience sort of teaching innovation and researching innovation and interacting with designers and creative individuals, throughout my research and my teaching of innovation, is that if you think about how creative professionals are trained, how they choose to become creative professionals in the first place, their talent, their vocation, it tends to be very much around, of course, kind of understanding who they're designing for or who they are kind of creating for. And they tend to be incredibly intuitive and talented at doing that. And they're trained on how to kind of extract better insights from that, et cetera. And then obviously they're trained and evaluated on their ability to kind of gain those insights and then translate those insights into a creative output. And that may be designing a product, designing a message, designing a house, like whatever it is that the creative professional is doing. And that's kind of how usually we think about them. That's how as creative professionals, you're trained. And that's kind of what gives you success, especially early on in your career. But I think, somebody who's experienced this intensely, and I know because I've learned a lot about this from Doug, is that, as you succeeded early in your career, then of course you become more and more successful. And eventually you start being asked to supervise others and to teach others and to manage others. And then all the skills and perspectives and preferences that made you successful in that earlier stage of your career, all of a sudden, it's not that they become less relevant, but it's like it's not what you actually need to do on a daily basis to succeed as a manager, as a supervisor, as a teacher of creative professionals. And it often happens that, when creative professionals reach that stage of their career, they are kind of a little bit lost because you haven't really thought about or been trained in, for example, how to design organizations or how organizations operate, or the language of organizations, the accounting of things, right? And that's just a very normal and typical transition in the career of creative professionals. And we identify this gap, and this is exactly what the program seeks to do, is to help creative professionals who have reached that stage of their careers to gain intuition, toolkits, insights into how organizations and how management operates so that they can then transition into the next stage of their careers.
That's a great way to kick things off. Since you did reference Doug, I'll give Doug a chance to chime in and add anything. You've recently been in roles of design leadership at places like Expedia, at IBM, so like quite large scale companies. And your design career has also kind of, I'm sure, changed a lot over the years. Is there anything you wanted to add to Rodrigo's opening statement?
Yeah, I think Rodrigo, you did a great job of framing it. I'll sort of add to that really more, if you think more broadly about where we are as a profession, I and the three of us on this call, and I'm guessing all of those in the audience right now, are among the first generation of design and creative leaders who are going through this phase of our career, because yes, design has existed for decades, generations, but at the scale that we're now dealing with, and in the complexity of the organizations that we're now working within, we just haven't done this before. Speaking for myself, every job that I've held in the last 10 years, I've been the first person to have that job. And so there's never been I've not had the playbook, the template, the guidance to really step into that role with the rules of engagement laid out for me. I've had to learn those rules. I've had to learn on the job. And so that's why I think programs like this are just so important right now for us to, you said it, Rodrigo, to kind of to see that gap there and really step in with some very relevant curricula and connections between each other. I think the peer-to-peer learning that goes on in this program is super, and not to diminish your role, Rodrigo, as a faculty leader, but the peer-to-peer learning I know is just as valuable as anything in this particular program. So
to reinforce what you just said, Doug, and to reinforce what you just said, and I often say this to my students. There's some stuff that I can teach in the classroom, but I think what becomes truly educational and transformative about good educational experiences is what happens in the network of students, the conversation they start having with each other, and especially the construction of a community of practice. Because one of the things that you just described very eloquently is that there's a loneliness that is experienced by creative professionals when they get to these challenges. And they're like, they know who to talk to for their creative challenges, and they have that studio culture from their training and their careers. But once they start getting to these challenges that are more about organizations and management, they tend to feel quite lonely and a little bit lost in terms of who to discuss these issues with. And I'm guessing that's one of the reasons why you stay in touch with your cohort from this program, is that all of a sudden you discover a community of practice that is dealing with similar issues as you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we really found each other. That this was I went through the program many years ago in 2007, but the core principles of the learning experience were very consistent, and we found each other, and we clung to each other, really. It was very important for us to have those relationships, and still is. We're still very much in touch, many of us.
That's amazing to hear. I'd love to maybe sketch out a little bit more about the experience. We've talked a bit about the organizational context. We can certainly come back to that. We've talked about the peer-to-peer learning and the community aspect of that. I'd love to explore a little bit now about just the general pedagogy of the program, other parts of the pedagogy of the program. One of the interesting things is that instead of teaching management topics in these separate single subject courses, the program is really meant to bring in experienced faculty, experienced designers, creative leaders in an integrated curriculum that provides these business frameworks and weaves them together in these real world contexts. And so, Rodrigo, I'd love to hear more about that. You're representing the faculty today, but maybe giving us an overview or a preview maybe of what some of your colleagues teach and how these things kind of mesh together.
Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate that. And I think you already did a really good job kind of just describing the I guess the philosophy behind it. I think it's worth mentioning just in general that one of the innovations that Yale pioneered a number of years ago is just transforming how we think about and how we train managers in general, right? And so traditionally in business schools, the way managers are trained is kind of through kind of disciplinary silos. And so the economists teach about economics, the sociologists teach about strategy and organizational structure, the psychologists teach about kind of motivation or incentives or things like that. And one of the things that Yale did, I don't know, like maybe around 2008, which is around the time that I joined, is that they said, you know what, that's just not how people experience problems. People don't experience problems with a label in the forehead of the problem that says like, oh, I'm an economics problem or I'm a incentives problem. Usually managers experience problems in all their messiness, and they have to figure out how to weave different kind of tools and perspectives into how they solve the problem. And so what Yale did is kind of like it went from imagine like a vertical way of teaching through silos, and it kind of flipped it on its head and started teaching horizontally around types of problems that managers face, right? And so instead of teaching economics and structure and incentives, they started teaching, well, there's problems about like managing employees. There's problems about innovation, which is the class that I designed and I led at Yale for a long time. There's problems around competing and managing and interacting with your competitors, right? And so that was called the integrated curriculum, because what it does is that when I led the innovation class and when I've taught the innovation class, what we do is like we integrate economics and sociology and psychology and what each of these disciplines has to say about how you organize and you manage innovation in an organization, right? For example, and the same with all the perspectives. And that philosophy of integrating different disciplines and different faculty into teaching types of problems is exactly how we designed the business perspectives for creative leaders program. We have identified kind of what are the typical types of problems that creative leaders at this stage in their career that we described earlier, what kinds of problems do they tend to face? And then what do different faculty in different disciplines have to say about this and teach us about this? And so that is the philosophy that we brought into the program, right? And so, for example, we will have faculty who will talk about kind of how do you decide what leadership style is most effective given your talent, given your experience, given what you need to do, and given the types of problems that you're seeking to solve in this stage of your career, right? And so I have colleagues who specialize in this question of like kind of the match between leadership styles and types of problems that you're facing, and participants in this program will receive training on this kind of decision-making for leaders, which is just a wonderful framework to help you first identify and understand what types of leadership best fit with who you are and your values and your personality, but then also conditions under which those types of leadership will be most effective and other conditions under which you may want to kind of tweak or adjust or enhance certain aspects of your leadership style. For example, right? We have another set of questions around kind of like change management. One of the things that creative professionals very often have to deal with is they had a small studio or firm, and now great news, they're being very successful. And that means that your organization needs to change a lot, right? And so managing that change process is just not an easy thing. And it's not something that we've been trained in. And so we will have kind of different perspectives from psychology, from sociology, from economics about how do you think about how do you manage organizational change and organizational growth. my class, the parts that I teach have very much to do with how do we think about the organizational structure that is required for kind of integrating creative professionals, but also the mirror image of that, which is like also sometimes we just have to execute and we have to operate. And what are the differences in the kinds of organizational structures that are required for creativity versus for execution? And so again, what we've done with the program is identify the most frequent and common problems that creative leaders face in these transitions in their careers. And then we give them the toolkits, the mindsets, and the best knowledge that there is right now on what we know about addressing and solving these problems. And I'm sorry that I'm speaking so much. I'll just end with this. Coupled with that, every day of the program, or every week of the program rather, we make sure that we carve out a space where these cohort effects that Doug was talking about earlier can happen. We make sure that we create the space and the structure so that participants can meet each other, can engage each other in conversation, so that they can start creating this cohort and this community of practice that they can take with them once they leave.
Yeah, thank you for expanding that context for us. As you were talking, Rodrigo, I kind of sketched this thing out here about like you as a leader and then your context, right? When you were talking about like, how do you, as a leader, like adapt where you're coming from, right? Like your base and your kind of personality, and then looking at what is your organizational context, and maybe that will change over time. We're at the little overlap in the Venn diagram. But I guess what I was thinking about this was you mentioned like bringing in psychology and economics, these kind of social science fields, and like maybe mapping it on to design language for people who've come up in design, right? Because I think there are similarities here of like, trying to find that little overlap. I'll stop showing my my two circle sketch, but there's iteration there, and there's like, coming up with your hypothesis and trying something and testing and going back, to kind of map that onto design language. And so I'm kind of curious about that, of like, how do you bring designers and people who've trained in this kind of design methods, design language, to maybe some of these other fields that are newer to them when they join the program?
I mean, I would love to hear Doug's perspective on this in a minute, but I would say kind of a couple of very, very quick things. One is one of the reframes that I try to do with participants is you have a vocation and a talent, and you've been trained in kind of these this discipline of empathy and connection with the people for whom you're designing. And at the same time, designers and creative professionals, in my experience, tend to be, on a generous day, they tend to be very skeptical of organizations. On an average day, they tend to be like dismissive and dislike organizations in general, right? And so one of the reframes that I often bring is like, that same compassion and empathy and ability for insight that you bring into kind of like understanding the people that you're designing for, if you try to use that superpower for understanding the constraints, the incentives, the experiences of people in organizations, you can actually do wonderful things. And the same ability that you have for empathy in design, when you turn that into the nature of organizations and the dynamics that organizations create, you basically already have a lot of what you need. You just need to understand how to adapt those skills into the design of organizations and the design of experiences inside of organizations. And that's something that I think creative professionals tend not to think a lot about. But once they do it and they see what the variables are, I would say, they usually become excellent at it, the way Doug has become excellent at creating organizational structures where creative leaders can thrive and can really have an impact in the organization. And so that's, I think, one example of the kinds of things that we try to accomplish in the program. But Doug, I would love to hear your perspective on this.
I think this is so important. I mean, the whole notion of language and vocabulary, and again, when you think about this progression that we're making from early to mid-career, very, typically I'm speaking in generalizations here, but oftentimes a very hands-on maker experience as a designer, taking on new leadership roles, maybe leading a small team, leading some projects, gaining some experience with that, some success, and then over time, the scale of that leadership role continues to expand. At some point, there's a tipping point where you're rather than spending most of your time with other designers, you are spending most of your time, and this was the case with me, you're spending most of your time with non-designers. And you're finding yourself more and more in conversations with leaders. Your peer group become leaders in other parts of the business. And that's challenging for a lot of reasons, but one of them is they speak a different language. And for almost all of us going through that progression of experiences, we don't learn that language. We aren't taught that language. We didn't go to school to learn that language. So again, we need to adapt it, and we need to become fluent in that language in some way. And that's challenging. So again, this, if you can be in a situation like this program where you get to practice the language, in real time with your peers, with Rodrigo and the other faculty, with a net, with a safety net, that's a real gift. And that's one of the clear, tangible ways that coming out of a program like this one, you're just going to have instant benefit.
You got a so true in the Q&A. So there's some affirmative agreement coming from the audience, which is great. And I'll take this as a pause to remind everyone you can type in the Q&A pod or just right here in the chat. If you have any questions, love to open it up to you all at any time, especially for the second half of things. I'll also pause and just share some of the logistical details. You can read all about it on the website, but sometimes it's helpful to just have somebody talk to you about it. The course launches at the end of April 27th, 2023. Registration closes a month before that, though, on March 23rd. So you have about 5 weeks to apply, and they ask for a current resume and a statement of intent. And there's some prompts there on the website. You can read more about it, but it's a 6-week program, roughly 20 hours of contact time total, with the outcome to develop your managerial and leadership expertise to drive innovation, influence colleagues, and lead teams, which we've been talking about here. But let's see if any audience questions. Yeah, Nicole, would love to hear about the courses. Do you have any classes that touch on diversity, inclusion, intersectionality, and equity from a design business perspective, and being on that from a leadership side?
I think that's a wonderful question. Nicole, what I would say is that questions of diversity, inclusion, we don't have a specific session where that's what we discuss. We don't have a class where that's the core of the session, because we believe that this is one of these questions that, and increasingly so, we've always believed it, but increasingly so, this is a fundamental principle and skill set that is required to succeed in management, like your ability to integrate diversity and your ability to include different perspectives is just a fundamental principle of management. And it becomes especially important in creative environments, right? And so what you will find is that I mentioned earlier, right? When we talk about leadership styles, diversity will enter in 2 ways. One is we recognize that contrary to popular images, popular language, popular expectations, actually there's a diversity of leadership styles that can be wonderfully effective, and embracing that diversity in leadership styles, including your own, is really important. And then also understanding that when you're leading and you have a particular style, there's a diversity of people that you're leading. And so how do those interact with each other, right? And so that's one example in which, diversity and inclusion is woven into, for example, the topic of leadership styles. when we talk about, just giving the same 3 examples that I gave earlier, not because those are the only 3 things that we teach, but because I already touched upon it. So it's easy for me to weave this into that, but it happens throughout the whole program. When we talk about change management, the same, right? Like different components of the organization that have different amounts of either real or expected or perceived power will react to change efforts differently, and you need to integrate them and kind of like engage with them effectively in any change effort. And so questions of diversity and inclusion are woven into how we talk about managing change in an organization. And in my old class about structuring environments for creativity versus kind of more on the operation side, I actually carve out a big chunk of those sessions to talk about questions of diversity and equity and inclusion, because, we can, there's two, we often talk about inclusion and equity as a hiring question, like how do we bring in more diversity into the organization? But what often happens is that we want to bring in more diverse people, but we don't create the structural conditions to ensure that they succeed. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about in my session is that if we're serious about truly integrating and embracing diversity, that means we have to really make sure that create the structural conditions so that these individuals can actually succeed. Otherwise, it's almost unethical to try to bring in a more diverse workforce when we don't have the structural conditions for them to succeed. And again, this is something that I've learned a lot from observing the way Doug has gone about his work, because I think he has been incredibly thoughtful in making sure that that happens. That it's not just like, I know for a fact that when he was at ABM, for example, and people were trying to bring in more designers, one of the things that Doug was very careful about is saying, like, I'm happy to bring in more designers, but not if we're going to bring them here and then they're not going to be able to succeed and not be able to build a career here. And so how do we make sure that we carve out and we design the organizational structures so that they can actually thrive here and can actually succeed? Doug, and I think it'd be wonderful for you to kind of complement this.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a great question, Nicole, an important question, one that we can no longer deprecate or dismiss, which I think has gone on for too long. And in our world, I think again, as relatively new types of leaders in oftentimes, older companies or companies that were established without design at their core, design and creative leaders now coming in with a new point of view, with a new set of priorities, with a worldview that is, hopefully refreshing and hopefully has takes a priority, places a priority on diversity, equity, inclusion, and intersectionality. How do we advocate for these priorities in really complex organizations where previously perhaps they haven't been prioritized in the way that we feel they need to be? And having those conversations and really being able to make the case in business terms, and there are business, there are moral terms and ethical terms and all of other reasons why this needs to happen. Yes, of course. And there are business reasons why it needs to happen. And so being able to understand that and work that into how we're approaching this set of issues is super important. And that's where I think Rodrigo's sort of horizontally oriented approach to this course, where you can weave an issue like this across multiple vertical elements, is really pretty important.
I wanted to address some of the logistical questions that have come in, and Rodrigo, please add to this. But somebody, well, first of all, the recording, yes, we will post this, and actually, once this live stream ends, you can just go to the AIGA Design LinkedIn or our YouTube channel, and it will be right there, and then we'll also do like an edited version where we trim out the beginning part, and you can watch that on aiga.org. After this, somebody was asking, when do the times meet? So it is synchronous online. There'll be like a set number of sessions. It is 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, starting on that end of April time slot. And there's also social hours on Tuesdays as well. So you can see more details of that on the Yale version of the site, where there's info there as well. Let's see what else is in the Q&A.
Well,
Somebody's
Diana,
also,
I think that gets to your question about time zone friendliness. That's why we have an early, like for classes. My experience with my students is that 8 a.m. can seem very early, and the reason why it starts so early is so that we can kind of try to make it friendly for different time zones, where especially for people in Europe who do often join this course.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting too, just looking at where people are chiming in from, both here in the Zoom and on the LinkedIn. We had people from all across the US, Canada, but also Western Europe. I think I saw India and New Zealand as well, and I know some of those are trickier time zones, but I think there's something about the online format that also makes it more accessible to folks in a way to tune in. You don't have to physically travel. And I know this has been since the pandemic started, kind of change in the program, right, from the in-person to the online. I'm wondering, Rodrigo, is there anything that you all have learned in the pedagogy and really like taken advantage of the best of online learning as part of this?
That's a great question, Lisan. As was just mentioned, the origin of this course was live in person at the Yale campus, and it used to last kind of only 1 week, and it worked great. I mean, that's the version that Doug took. It worked great, and actually, Doug, I think you were at the old campus, like before the School of Management moved to the new building, which was almost like a family setting. And that worked great, and it was a good course. And then obviously COVID forced us to rethink things, and we created this kind of live online version. And I have to say, like, given for this community, I have become increasingly convinced that live online is a better format for the following reasons. Number one, I think that I hadn't quite, and this is going to sound embarrassing because it is, but I hadn't quite internalized or realized the degree to which, taking a week off of your work to go to Yale and be there for a week, like that's just not accessible for a lot of people who could really benefit from this program, right? And so just like one of the first things that shocked me when we did the live online version because of COVID was that the diversity of participants increased immediately. And it surprised me. And of course, the second I thought about it, I was like, oh, well, of course, not everybody can travel and spend a week. Yeah, but I hadn't quite thought about that fully until I saw how much diversity increased when we offered it live online. And so I think that was one thing. The second thing, and this has to do with kind of the community creation part, when we went from 1 week intensive to live online, we needed to kind of like design it to fit the experience of people who are going to continue working in their jobs and are going to take this at the same time. And so we expanded it to 6 weeks instead of like, intensive in a few days. Like we kind of expanded it over 6 weeks so that people can do their work and then join this. And again, that also increased the diversity of participants. But then also what ends up happening is that participants, number one, establish a longer relationship with each other and get to know each other much better, because instead of like interacting intensely over a few days, they have a conversation that ends up lasting for 6 weeks. And so the relationships are actually stronger, and from what I hear from participants, even longer lasting. And then the other thing that is a benefit of this kind of format where it expands for 6 weeks is that participants start taking the courses, and then they get to experiment with these things in their work. And then the next week they come back, and when the way we weave it all together is that I always start the week session with asking people to tell me about the experiments that they tried out and how things are working out and what they've learned and what they've realized. And it's just amazing to see what happens when you are experimenting, again, with, as Doug mentioned, with the safety net of the program, but you begin experimenting with the concepts of the course as you continue working, and then you come back to the course and we get to discuss it over 6 weeks. And these are things that you just cannot do when you have an intensive in-person 1 week program. And these are things that we've learned in kind of the adaptation and redesign of the course to make it live online.
Yeah, I feel like that
Rodrigo,
breathing room is really interesting. Having that week in between sessions.
Doug, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I have a related question, Rodrigo, about sort of the rigor of the course work and the expectations around not only the sort of live learning, but if there's work, essentially homework between courses that you're doing. I know when I took the course many years ago, it was that 1 week intensive version. It was quite rigorous. There was quite a lot of reading that was expected, and that was great. Really was a substantive experience educationally. But there were some of us who stepped into that and were a little surprised that it was as rigorous as it actually was. Can you maybe speak to that?
No, we've retained that rigor, Doug, and actually we've I don't want to say we increased it, but we made it more pragmatic and useful for people, because, for example, there are now there's an aspect of it where you get to ask your peers to rate your leadership style, for example, and that's an assessment that you do, and you bring that information with you to the session, and you get to discuss it, and you get to write. And so that the expectation of preparation and reading remains. And there are certain things where the homework is actually, you have to go and think about this or experiment with it or ask for feedback from others and then bring that to the next session. And so that rigor has remained, and we've made it even more interconnected with your daily reality.
Nice.
Okay, we have some more logistical questions. A couple people are asking, do you know if the program will ever return to in-person, and how big is the cohort usually?
That's harder for me to answer. I don't know if there is someone from the Yale side here who can remind me, but if I remember correctly, cohorts tend to be about 30. Is what I'm thinking is the usual number, 30 to 40 people probably. I may be wrong, but that's just my memory of kind of how many people I normally see in the groups.
Yeah, I got DM'd between 20 and 40 is the official answer.
Okay, so I wasn't that wrong. Good. Yeah, usually I just remember 30 as a number that is very frequent in these cohorts. And as to whether we will return to in-person, we've talked about it a lot. And right now, given that the balance has been that there's been more benefits to doing it this way, because again, of diversity and experience and everything, we're not sure, maybe, but we're not sure. At least that's my answer right now, but maybe Janet will say like, I don't know, maybe some decisions have been made that happen, in the background to me.
There's an additional question about like the out of class commitments in terms of time. Like, what do you estimate for like the homework outside of the Thursday class
No,
meetings?
it is. I mean, the expectation is that usually we assign things that you'll bring to the session so that you take much more advantage of the session itself. I wouldn't say it's enormous. Usually, for example, you might need to read a case and think about it, or might need to kind of like do a survey and ask other people to do a survey for you, and then you'll be presented with the data, or you need to kind of reflect on something. And so, um, I would say maybe 3 extra hours on top of the hours of the sessions per week would be my guess on average.
All right. And then we have Santiago has a question about can the cost be financed or there's any financial aid? There are like discounts for different categories, like if 3 or more people from your company join, or if you previously participated in a Yale executive ed program or work for a nonprofit. So there's categories like that you can learn more on the Yale website. There's also a sample letter there if you want to get assistance from your employer. I don't know if there's anything to add to that, Rodrigo.
This is one of the things that is kind of like something that I have zero control over. And so I think what you answered is probably the best answer we have here collectively.
Yeah. And there's also something for veterans as well, but check out all of the categories online because there's quite a few.
I will say that if speaking from the point of view of somebody who's worked inside big companies, if you haven't explored the opportunities, and if you're working in a big company, not even a big company, but a company of any sort of size and complexity, in all likelihood, there's professional development, budget that is out there, and sometimes you have to look under some rocks and you have to knock on some doors virtually or otherwise to find that. So I would encourage you to really pursue that if that's an issue for you. And I know that as an executive in a larger company, I'm able to make a pretty good case for people on my teams to attend programs like this, and so certainly check that out if you haven't already.
All right, let's see. I think there's one more question that just popped up here. What is the acceptance rate, or how competitive is the application process, is Lindy's question.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you. I actually don't know. But I think that the website, I'm looking at the website right now, and it seems like it has kind of all the information there that you might need. And I know that the Yale folks who are on the administrative side of this are incredibly responsive, and they would get back to you immediately on these kinds of more administrative questions. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you. I just don't. To be completely transparent, I manage the academic side. I don't know that much about the administrative side of this.
Yeah, they're very responsive, as Rodrigo said, and like if you like sign up with your email and stuff, like you'll get like a real person if you respond back. So you can ask your questions for like admissions and things like that through them. Any other questions from the audience, or we can also just turn to Rodrigo and Doug to see if you had any parting thoughts for us to wrap up with.
Let me just, Heather, you're asking what is the typical current job level for most attendees, and have you seen the kind of uptick of promotions after attending? That second part, you're asking an academic to give you kind of a data-driven question. And so I'm going to feel very hesitant to say, like, I will say that I am always incredibly moved by the number of former students who write to me with some frequency and say, like, oh, I still remember that, like, it was thanks to this course that I did this and that, and it really helped me in these ways. And so my what's it called? Like it's like my anecdotal experience is that people find it really helpful, and that's why this program has continued to kind of evolved throughout the years. It's been it's a program that has kind of lasted for a long time, and it's because people get a lot of value from it. And so I think the answer anecdotally is yes, but I don't have the data to back it up. The typical, I would say that there are kind of like 2 or 3 archetypical moments where students find this especially useful. One is you started your own firm and you kind of struggled for a while, and now you're succeeding, and that's great, but now you actually have to hire more people, and it's like, oh well, now I have this other problem, which is my organization is growing. So that's one archetype. A second archetype of student is, you were promoted to management, and all of a sudden you're finding that what got you here is not what's going to get you there. As Doug was saying, all of a sudden you find yourself constantly having conversations where it's a different type of conversation with a different audience than you used to. And the third one is like you are just, there's a growing group or a growing practice within an organization where you're building the design practice within the organization. And as people are trying to figure out how to make that design practice more successful and better integrated to what the firm is doing. So those are 3 archetypical students that I think benefit disproportionately from the program.
And I see the Yvonne's question here, just giving an example of a director and above. My sense, and again, I haven't been directly connected with the program in quite some time, but speaking from a leader in a big company and just sort of envisioning what types of individuals and what career levels would benefit most from this, I think you're right, spot on there, Yvonne. I think it's, again, titling is so wonky across the profession, but generally a director level, that's the sweet spot. I think that's somebody who is probably in their first, senior management role, organizational, in charge perhaps of a P&L, and responsible for a scaled organization rather than a single team. That's where this is, I think, really going to be particularly valuable. I would say to your other question, Yvonne, you mentioned ICs or individual contributors. Again, from my point of view as an executive, perhaps sending someone from my team, I'm thinking probably more on the management side than the IC side, as far as what's going to be most valuable here.
And if I could answer, so Stacy asked this interesting question about like, what are the arguments that you can use to pitch this to your employers for why this is something that would be valuable to the organization, not just to you individually. As Lisa said, like there's a sample letter on the website that you can see, but I will complement this with a few things that I say to my MBA students when I'm teaching MBAs for why they need to integrate more designers and integrate more design into what they do into their organizations. I would argue that number one, and everything that I'm going to say, I think is increasingly true. But if you think about some of the key challenges that organizations are facing externally, the types of problems that organizations are facing are increasingly about integration of perspectives and truly understanding, for example, stakeholders and the perspective of different stakeholders and how to integrate that into the solutions that they're crafting. I think it's increasingly true for all types of organizations and businesses. And designers can need to play a central role in that. Traditionally, it used to be the case that we design our business model, our product, et cetera, and then at some point in that we bring in designers after we've designed or we've chosen our business model or our products. And I think increasingly, given the changing nature of problems, organizations are facing that they need to bring in design much earlier and integrate it much earlier into the way they think about things, the way they carve out a strategy, the way they carve out a business model. And the earlier you integrate, I mean, truly integrate the methods and the approaches of design into how you do things as an organization, the more effective you're going to be throughout. And so that's the first thing that I'll say. But then internally, I think that increasingly there's the labor market and the labor force is changing, and their expectations about the type of experience that they're going to have inside of the organization is changing. And just internally having a designers or a creative perspective into how you design the organization for the internal audience that is employees becomes increasingly important. And both of these things, both with your external audiences and your internal audiences, integrating the design perspective, the design approach, the ethos of design into how you operate as a business becomes a competitive advantage. And so that's how I would sell this to an employer. But also we have an expert in this, which is Doug, who's convinced more than one organization that they need to take this very, very seriously. So Doug, how have you framed it before to the organization?
Yeah, I think every organization wants design to succeed, and every organization needs to see the evidence, the proof that it is contributing to their business in order to invest more heavily in it. So we as leaders need to, we need to get better in most cases at making that case, at demonstrating that evidence, collecting that evidence and demonstrating, telling the story of it. That is exactly what's being taught in this course. That's what you're going to get better at. And so if you're going to your leadership and saying, hey, I need to get better at this, you need me to get better at this is how I can do it. That's a pretty compelling case, that I am going to get better at this, and you and this business are going to see value from that. That's essentially the dots that you need to connect between you going to this course and the business seeing value from it.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I think we have one final question from Roberto, who was asking about the value that this course could bring for design educators. And I don't know, Doug or Rodrigo, if you had any thoughts on that.
I was just typing an answer to Roberto, but I'll read my version of that. I think for most design educators, I don't see that they're not going to be in the center of the bullseye for this course, with a couple of exceptions. One would be if you're teaching about design management or design, the business of design in your coursework. If that's what you're teaching, there's probably going to be some real value here. Secondly, if you are leading an academic program, which is oftentimes or has a lot of components that are very similar to leading a business, then again, there's probably going to be some correlation here. That would be my answer, for Rodrigo.
I agree with that, Doug, and I would just add a third one, which is increasingly, I think, in design and creative programs, students are demanding and programs are teaching questions of kind of more integrative design or complex problem design, or designing for complex problems. And in designing for complex problems where you need integration across perspectives and organizations, etc., understanding organizations and understanding management becomes a really critical skill set. So I would add that third type of design teaching that can benefit a lot.
Awesome. Well, we are right on time to wrap up. Thank you, Rodrigo, again, and Doug, and everybody for your questions, for tuning in, or if you're watching this in the future in the recording, thank you for making it to the end with us as well. We'll post this on the AIGA website probably tomorrow or Tuesday, since Monday is a holiday for us. And yeah, get in touch with the Yale admissions team if you have additional logistical questions. They are super responsive, and they will hook you up with those answers. So have a great rest of the day and week, everyone, and see you next time. Take care.
So thank you, everybody.